Dear viewers, the following stories are inspired by real events. However, the names of the characters have been changed to protect privacy. Story 1. Obsession Next Door. Emily, whose real name is Sarah Miller, a young woman who had just moved to the peaceful neighborhood of Maplewood in New Jersey in the summer of 2005, was thrilled to have found a charming little house with a spacious garden. Her neighbors seemed friendly, especially the old man living next door. His name was Arthur, whose real name is George Wilson, a gaunt man with snow-white hair and kind, light blue eyes. Initially, Emily felt very lucky to have such a kind neighbor. A few weeks after moving in, Emily began to notice strange things about Arthur. He often stood at his window and looked over at Emily's house, even when she was inside. Sometimes, when Emily was working in her garden, Arthur would appear at the fence separating their properties and strike up a conversation with her. His stories were often rambling and seemed a bit odd, but Emily always tried to listen politely. One afternoon, when Emily was hanging laundry in her yard, Arthur suddenly appeared and asked her about her job. Emily felt a little uncomfortable with his curiosity but answered politely. Then, Arthur started talking about his deceased wife, his voice becoming sad and his eyes welling up with tears. Emily felt sympathy for the old man but also had an indescribable feeling of unease. Arthur's strange actions became more frequent. He started leaving small gifts on Emily's doorstep, sometimes a wilted bouquet of flowers, sometimes an opened box of candy, and once Emily even found an old photograph of herself placed on her porch step. This really frightened Emily. She started avoiding Arthur and tried not to interact with him anymore. Emily told her best friend, Jessica, whose real name is Amanda Clark, about this. Jessica advised Emily to install security cameras to monitor Arthur's actions. Emily followed her friend's advice and installed a few hidden cameras around her house. She hoped that this footage could help her understand what was really going on. After a few days of monitoring, Emily reviewed the footage and discovered disturbing things. The camera had recorded Arthur frequently standing in front of her house at night, staring inside. Once, Emily even saw Arthur sneaking into her garden and picking a rose. These actions made Emily feel increasingly insecure and scared. One evening, when Emily was home alone, she heard a soft knock on the door. She looked through the peephole and saw Arthur standing outside. He was holding a small cake and had a kind smile on his face. Emily didn't dare open the door. She pretended she wasn't home. But Arthur continued to knock and call her name, his voice becoming pleading and somewhat begging. Eventually, Arthur left, but Emily still felt uneasy. She decided to call the police to report her neighbor's strange behavior. When the police arrived and listened to Emily's story, they promised to investigate and advised her to be careful. That night, Emily didn't sleep well. She constantly felt like someone was watching her from outside her window. After reporting the incident to the police, Emily felt a little safer. But her anxiety about Arthur didn't disappear. She still frequently checked the security cameras and always carefully locked her doors. A few days later, the police came to talk to Arthur, but he denied all allegations and seemed very surprised to learn that Emily was scared. However, Arthur's strange actions continued. He started leaving bizarre handwritten letters in Emily's mailbox. These letters contained incomprehensible and somewhat threatening words. Emily felt increasingly frightened and decided to find out more about Arthur's past. She asked other neighbors and discovered that he had lived there alone for many years after his wife passed away. An older neighbor named Mrs. Davis, whose real name is Margaret Johnson, told Emily a frightening story about Arthur. She said that Arthur used to have a daughter, but the little girl had mysteriously disappeared many years ago. And since then Arthur had become very strange and withdrawn. Hearing Mrs. Davis's story, Emily felt a great suspicion towards Arthur. She began to pay attention to the small details in his behavior. And she realized that Arthur often stared at the children playing in the neighborhood with a strange look in his eyes. This made Emily even more worried about her own safety and the safety of those around her. One afternoon, when Arthur was away from his house, Emily decided to try and explore his garden. She climbed over the fence and went into the overgrown garden behind Arthur's house. While walking along a small path, Emily suddenly saw an old cellar door hidden by dense bushes. Curiosity compelled her to open the cellar door. As she descended the dark and damp stairs, Emily felt a strong, foul odor hit her nose. She shivered and turned on her phone's flashlight. The weak light illuminated the cluttered basement, and Emily was horrified by what she saw. In this dark cellar, she saw many old dolls, children's clothes, and photographs of little girls with hair exactly like Emily's. Emily felt an overwhelming terror. She quickly ran out of the cellar and climbed back into her own garden. She knew she had discovered a dark and terrifying secret about her seemingly kind neighbor. Emily immediately called the police and told them everything. This time, the police acted immediately. When the police raided Arthur's house, they found more evidence indicating his involvement in his daughter's disappearance many years ago. And possibly other cases. Arthur was arrested and brought to justice. Emily later moved away, but the haunting memory of her scary neighbor and the dark secret in his basement remained a terrifying experience in her life. Story 2. The Scratching on the Wall. Mark, whose real name is David Lee, a 28-year-old software engineer, had just moved into the Oakwood apartments in Chicago in the winter of 2012. He chose a third-floor apartment that was quiet and had a nice view of the park in front. His neighbors were mostly young professionals and newly married couples, except for Mrs. Helen, whose real name is Dorothy Williams, an elderly woman in her 70s who lived in the apartment across the hall. Mrs. Helen seemed kind, always smiling and greeting Mark whenever they crossed paths. The first few weeks passed peacefully. Mark was busy with his new job and settling into life in a new city. He occasionally chatted with Mrs. Helen in the hallway. She often shared old memories and asked about Mark's life. At first, he thought she was just a bit nosy but figured it was just the concern of an older neighbor living alone. However, gradually, Mark began to notice strange things. Mrs. Helen seemed to always know when he came home from work and would often be standing ready at her apartment door to greet him. Sometimes, when Mark was cooking, he would hear a soft knock on his door, and when he opened it, he would find Mrs. Helen standing there with a plate of homemade cookies or a bowl of hot soup. He thanked her but felt a bit uneasy about these unexpected visits. One evening, when Mark was watching a movie, he heard a frantic knocking on his door. He opened it to find Mrs. Helen standing there with a worried look on her face. She said she had heard strange noises coming from Mark's apartment and was afraid something was wrong. Mark reassured her that everything was fine, but Mrs. Helen insisted on coming in to check. Mark reluctantly let her in. After that incident, Mrs. Helen became even stranger. She started calling Mark at odd hours, sometimes just to ask if he was asleep or to tell rambling, incoherent stories. Mark tried to politely end the calls, but Mrs. Helen didn't seem to want to stop. He began to feel disturbed and lost sleep because of these calls. One night, Mark woke up to a soft scratching sound coming from the wall separating his apartment from Mrs. Helen's. He listened more closely and realized it was the sound of fingernails scratching against the wall. This eerie sound lasted for a while and then stopped. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't explain what that sound was. The scratching sounds on the wall began to occur more frequently, usually at night when everything was quiet. Mark tried to ignore them, but the sound kept repeating, making him feel incredibly uncomfortable and anxious. He suspected that Mrs. Helen might be trying to communicate with him in some way, but he didn't understand why she would do it like that. One evening, as Mark was getting ready for bed, he heard a very soft knock on his door. He looked through the peephole and saw Mrs. Helen standing there. But this time, she wasn't smiling. She looked at him with a blank and terrifying stare. In her hand, she held something long and sharp. Mark felt an overwhelming fear engulf him. He quickly backed away and locked the door. The knocking continued, becoming more frantic and desperate. After that terrifying night, Mark barely dared to sleep. He sat with his back against the door, listening to every little sound coming from outside. The next morning, he called the building management to report Mrs. Helen's strange behavior. But they only took down the information and said they would remind her to keep quiet at night. Mark felt frustrated and decided to find out more about Mrs. Helen himself. He asked other neighbors and discovered that she had lived there alone for a very long time after her husband passed away. Some said she seemed a bit eccentric and often did strange things. But no one had ever seen her cause any serious problems. The scratching sounds on the wall continued every night. Mark tried to record the sounds as evidence. But every time he turned on the recorder, the scratching would stop. It seemed like Mrs. Helen knew when he was trying to record her actions. One evening, while Mark was in the kitchen, he suddenly saw a shadow pass under his door. He quickly opened the door but saw no one. However, he noticed that Mrs. Helen's apartment door was slightly ajar. Mark felt curious and decided to peek inside. Mrs. Helen's apartment was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bedroom. Mark cautiously stepped inside and quietly called her name, but no one answered. As he approached the bedroom, he saw Mrs. Helen sitting on her bed, her back to the door. She was muttering something that Mark couldn't quite hear. Mark moved closer and placed his hand on Mrs. Helen's shoulder. She startled and turned around, and Mark was horrified to see her face was pale white. Her eyes rolled back, and her mouth was wide open as if screaming. But no sound came out. In her hand, she still held the sharp object Mark had seen the night before, a silver dinner fork that had been sharpened. Mark recoiled in fear. Mrs. Helen slowly stood up and moved towards him, her eyes still blank and terrifying. She raised the fork, ready to attack Mark. He quickly ran out of Mrs. Helen's apartment and towards his own front door. He heard heavy footsteps chasing after him. Mark opened his apartment door and rushed inside, locking the door behind him and calling the police. When the police arrived and broke down Mrs. Helen's apartment door, they discovered a horrifying scene. Mrs. Helen was dead on her bed. The silver fork she had been holding plunged into her chest. The investigation revealed that she had committed suicide, but no one could explain her strange and terrifying behavior in the days leading up to her death. And Mark would forever be haunted by the memory of his neighbor in the apartment across the hall. Lisa, whose real name is Michelle Davis, a 32-year-old elementary school teacher, lived alone in a small house in the Oak Haven neighborhood of California in the spring of 2009. Her life was quite peaceful until a man named Robert, whose real name is James Thompson, moved into the house next door. Robert was a middle-aged man who didn't talk much, with a somewhat stern appearance. But Lisa didn't think much of it at first. A few weeks later, Lisa began to notice strange actions by Robert. He spent a lot of time gardening, often late at night, under the glow of the floodlights from his house. Lisa often saw his silhouette hunched over in the garden, digging and planting something. What was strange was that Robert's garden was always enclosed by a high wooden fence, making it impossible for Lisa to see clearly inside. One morning, Lisa went out to water her plants and noticed a foul, putrid odor coming from Robert's property. The stench was strong, like rotting meat. Lisa felt nauseous and quickly went back inside. She told herself that Robert was probably just fertilizing his plants. But the smell lingered in her mind all day. In the following days, the foul odor became even stronger. Lisa began to feel uncomfortable and anxious. She noticed Robert frequently carrying large black bags to his backyard at night. And then he would light a big fire. The smoke that rose was dark and carried the unpleasant smell. Lisa suspected that Robert was doing something shady behind that fence. One afternoon, while Lisa was home alone, she heard loud barking coming from Robert's house. His dog, a large Rottweiler, was usually very gentle, but that day it barked continuously and scratched fiercely at the fence as if it was very scared. Lisa felt that something was wrong. That night, Lisa couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed. Around 2 a.m., she heard a strange noise coming from Robert's property. It sounded like metal clanging against metal. Very eerie. Lisa tiptoed to her balcony and looked over at Robert's house. She saw his silhouette hunched over in the backyard. Under the dim moonlight, Lisa clearly saw Robert digging a large hole. Lisa felt an overwhelming fear. She didn't understand why Robert would be digging a hole in the middle of the night. And the foul smell along with the dog's frantic barking earlier made her even more suspicious. She decided to call a close friend named Mark, whose real name is Kevin Wilson, to tell him about the strange things happening with her neighbor. Mark advised Lisa to be careful and offered to stay with her for a few days. That night, while Lisa was sitting in the living room with Mark, they suddenly heard a soft thud coming from the back door. Mark carefully went to the window and peeked out. He whispered to Lisa in horror, "Robert's out there." Lisa followed Mark's gaze and saw Robert standing right in front of her back door. In his hand, he held a shovel covered in dirt, and he was staring inside with a cold smile. Story 2. Buried Secrets. After seeing Robert standing at her back door, Lisa and Mark quickly called the police. While waiting, they locked all the doors and tried to stay quiet. When the police arrived and checked the surrounding area, Robert had disappeared without a trace. The police advised Lisa to install security cameras and report immediately if she saw Robert doing anything suspicious. In the following days, Lisa lived in fear. She always felt Robert's eyes on her, even though she no longer saw him appear directly. The foul odor from Robert's backyard still lingered, and the dog's frantic barking continued to echo at night. Lisa decided to investigate what Robert was hiding. One afternoon, when Robert was away, Lisa sneaked into his backyard. The high fence made it difficult for her to see inside, but she found a small gap and peeked through. What she saw horrified her. In the overgrown garden, Lisa saw several black bags similar to the ones Robert often carried to the backyard. And one of them was torn, revealing contents that Lisa couldn't believe. Inside the torn bag, Lisa saw white bone fragments and a few long strands of brown hair. She felt her stomach churn. She quickly left Robert's backyard and ran back to her house. She knew she had discovered something terrible. Lisa immediately called the police and told them what she had seen. This time, the police acted very quickly. They arrived at Robert's house and conducted a search. The strong, foul odor led them to the backyard, where they found a freshly dug hole. And inside were the black bags filled with human remains. Robert was arrested shortly thereafter. During the interrogation, he confessed that he had murdered several people and buried their bodies in his backyard. His reason for doing so was that he believed these people were sinners and needed to be punished. Robert's confession shocked and horrified the entire Oakhaven neighborhood. After Robert's arrest, the police excavated his backyard and found the remains of 3 other individuals. Robert's Rottweiler, it turned out, had been barking frantically every time he carried a victim's body out to bury it. It was like a silent witness to the gruesome crimes that had occurred. Lisa never forgot what happened in the Oakhaven neighborhood in the spring of 2009. Her quiet and seemingly ordinary neighbor had hidden a terrifying secret. His backyard garden wasn't a place for flowers and plants, but a burial ground for innocent victims. This story remains a chilling reminder of the evil that can lurk behind the facade of the people around us. If you want to hear more true horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to my channel.